Hello, everybody, and welcome at the Global Conference of Media Freedom here in Tallinn, Estonia. We will start with a panel which is entitled Ways Forward, Systemic Solutions and Other Mobilizations. I will start by explaining why we decided and we suggested to the Foreign Ministry of Estonia to co-organize this session as Reporters Without Borders, RSF. RSF used to be what I would say a classical press freedom watchdog, using the naming and shaming strategy. But due to the technological changes, even to the change of paradigm of the information ecosystem, due to the geopolitical changes, we had to amend our strategies and to continue to defend individuals, to work on specific cases. But we had also to work on more systemic change, not just to address consequences, but also to address the causes. And that's why Reporters Without Borders entered into a new logic with structural systemic initiatives, the Journalism Trust Initiative, the Partnership on Information and Democracy, and some others. We will discuss it later in this session, but also discuss other very important systemic initiatives. We will start, because we will have two chapters in this event. The next one will be moderated by my colleague, Rebecca Vincent. The first one will be on solutions to protect journalists and end impunity. And we will be lucky guys. We will have with us today Rebecca Vincent, who will speak about a potential UN Special Representative for the Safety of Journalists. We will have with us Gulnara Akundova of IMS, International Media Support, about a project of an impunity, a task force to fight impunity for crimes against journalists. And we will start, this is an honor for us, with Evelien Dijkstra, with the Advocacy Director for Free Press Unlimited, based in the Netherlands, a very important organization. She will be speaking about a very original initiative, which is the People's Tribunal, an innovative project established to investigate the murders of journalists and hold governments accountable. I invite Evelien to join me and to sit on the stage.
Thanks.
So, Evelien, what is this People's Tribunal? There is an historical inspiration.
There is. So it actually came about because I think as civil society, we were working on the issue of impunity for a long time already, jointly with you, with others involved here today as well. And we all kind of got stuck facing the myth that it is not possible to achieve justice for the murders of journalists or for violence in general. And we were thinking, what to do about this. There are several reasons for impunity. It's a lack of resources, a lack of capacity. But we all know that, like, the third reason, a lack of political will, is the general problem in fighting impunity.
And that's why you decided, I had the chance to participate in the first trial, or part of the trial, which was really a very impressive moment in The Hague, in the Netherlands.
Definitely.
So you created a tribunal.
Definitely, yeah. So the idea was, if we're not going to wait for states to take up this opportunity now, and in the absence of action by them, we're going to start this initiative ourselves, and we're going to do a kind of grassroots form of justice, which is a People's Tribunal, which, as you mentioned, started 40 years ago already. It's organized by the Permanent People's Tribunal of Rome, and they've organized many different tribunals that were started by people asking or demanding action on certain topics. And this was actually the first time they're doing a People's Tribunal on the murder of journalists in The Hague. And as you said, we started on 2 November with an opening hearing. We'll have 3 more case hearings coming up. So these will be specific case hearings on cases of journalist murders in Sri Lanka, in Syria, and in Mexico. And we'll have a closing hearing that actually comes up with a preliminary judgment, because the whole idea of a tribunal is, of course, that you have a tribunal set up. So you have a prosecutor, you have a panel of judges, and you have witnesses that are being that are testifying at the tribunal. So
this is a fake tribunal, if you allow this expression,
yes.
but with real judges, with an experience in the field?
Yes, that's correct.
No power to put people in jail?
No.
But with potential very concrete
Exactly. So the idea
effects.
the idea is not to hold people individually responsible, not even in the cases that we're going to discuss on the countries that I mentioned, but it's about the state responsibility to act on the obligation to protect journalists and to act and investigate any attacks against them. So it's showing that it's a systemic problem, and it's showing that it is possible to do something. If you actually take up this opportunity to investigate cases, then it is possible to.
Can you give us an example of the cases this tribunal deals with?
Yes, of course, of course. So the first one, actually, well, it's not true because all of the dates changed due to COVID. But the initial first one would be on a journalist called Lasantha Wickrematunge from Sri Lanka, and who was murdered in a very brutal way. And so we're going to show the situation of this case. We're going to have a full day explaining the case, hear all witnesses, people involved, people used to work with, etc. And then the second day will be about the situation that was created afterwards. So what is the consequence of this impunity? What is the consequence of this attack on the society and on people's right to information, access to information afterwards? So it's building the case, creating the evidence that is needed to actually prosecute the case, but also showing there is a broader issue here that needs to be addressed.
We will deal right after with an investigation task force, a project, a request. How did you investigate cases? Can you explain us very concretely how you did work? And we were really fascinated by the amount of work you realized.
Definitely, yeah. So we rely for this on specific local partners. So for the Syria case, we work with the Syria Center for Media Freedom, and for the Sri Lanka case, we work with. So in every case, we work with a specific local partner doing all the preparation work. We work together with the prosecutor who does the legal preparations, and then the case can be presented as an official case at the tribunal, which I think is very, it shows very, very clearly that it is possible to do this work. And well, actually, in addition to the tribunal work, as part of the A Safer World for the Truth project, it's called, we're also doing 8 cold case investigations into murders of journalists from a longer while ago. And there we see actually that when you do these investigations, it is possible even 10 years later to find new evidence and to get the justice system on the national level reopened. So there's actually 3 cases where we already published reports on. There's 5 more reports coming up, as you know. But we really see potential there to also work on the national level, which is, I think, very much needed, complementary to the more international work on the tribunal.
Thank you. I don't know if at this stage there is already a question from the room. Do not hesitate, if yes, but in any case, there will be a Q&A session at the end. So please prepare your questions. I will now invite our colleague from IMS, International Media Support, Gulnara Akundova. She's the Global Response Head of Department in this important organization. Please join us on the stage. And Gulnara will be speaking on efforts to establish an international multi-stakeholder task force to investigate threats and crimes against journalists. Tell us more.
Thank you, Christophe. Thank you for having me here. Well, you and I, we share a common belief that if states implement their international commitments, then media workers will be able to do their job freely and safely. So we also know that international human rights law provides for media freedom and safety of journalists. What is lacking is implementation and political will by the states. And we work with our partners, Reporters Without Borders, but also with partners in countries on the ground to fight impunity and provide for safety of journalists. However, very often, and I'm sure you will share this, we often stumble a wall. It's just against the wall because there is no political will by the states. And we also know that it is often the state who is the culprit. So we need to close this gap in implementation of human rights standards. And
who will order investigations to be realized? How would it function, this task force? Who would say, now we investigate this crime or this threat?
Yeah, so the idea that there is a multilateral task force that will deploy and investigate on the ground. And when I say multilateral, then we obviously talk about UN and special mandate holders because they have more freedom. So they do not necessarily rely on domestic remedies to be completely exhausted before they intervene. And they are also have freedom to communicate their concerns and provide recommendation directly to the states. But of course, special rapporteurs will provide international legitimacy for the task force, but at the same time, national legitimacy should also be ensured. So that's why it's important that civil society and media, independent civil society and media on the ground are involved.
And who would investigate? Who would be the forces to investigate? The policemen or women?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because obviously then you would need specific expertise to investigate. And here, again, depending on the case, it could be forensic experts, it could be expert in relation to like if it, the killing could also happen in detention or in jail. So that really depends on the case, but it would be forensic experts like investigators who have experience in investigating. But the task force should be led by representatives from intergovernmental organizations, and I'm talking about UN and UN special rapporteurs.
And how would you avoid political neutralization, which is always a risk at the international stage?
Well, all states, they have subscribed to commitments, and values are universal. If you are a member state of the United Nations, then you share common universal values and principles. So we can't talk about neutrality or impartiality here, because states have subscribed, and this is their obligation. And UN special rapporteurs, they are independent experts. They are independent, and they are neutral.
Okay. Is there any question at this stage? Not for the moment. You keep your strong questions for the end. So this is very complementary.
It is.
I think that this panel has been really well organized. And this is also very complementary with what Rebecca Vincent will present. And we will be back to you right after. Rebecca, please join us on stage. you will introduce a way to counter threats to the safety of journalists and promote renewed international cooperation.
Yes, thank you, Christophe. And just to mention, I know Christophe has said this, but from my side as well, we're so pleased at Reporters Without Borders to partner on both of your initiatives. And what we're going to present here today, too, we very much see as mutually reinforcing, certainly not in competition. I think the situation for safety of journalists around the world is so dire that we need these solutions. We need to try different things and hope that they work. The global situation we're looking at is more than 1,000 journalists have been killed over the past decade, the vast majority with full or partial impunity. Year by year, we see an increase in the sort of nuanced ways that journalists can be attacked. We see an increase in things like online harassment that too often are leading to physical attacks as well. And we see too many journalists killed in countries around the world in connection with their work. Alarmingly, at Reporters Without Borders, we've noticed an increase even in attacks on journalists working in countries that are meant to be at peace. It's no longer just the places that we think of as traditionally dangerous. So it's very clear that we cannot be complacent anywhere and that we need more effective tools, not only to end impunity for crimes against journalists, but to proactively protect them, to reduce these sorts of attacks going forward, not just to respond when the worst has already happened. So one of our solutions for this at Reporters Without Borders, we've been working towards the establishment of a UN Special Representative for the Safety of Journalists. This is a kind of different animal to a special rapporteur. It would be a special representative of the Secretary General that would be tasked with making all of the existing UN machinery actually work, actually be effective and follow up, in alerting the UN system when there are new threats against journalists instead of just waiting to react afterwards. And to really mobilize the entire international system. It would be a sort of protector of journalists within the UN system, if you will. So this has been underway for a number of years now, but we've been really encouraged by the increased momentum in support of this campaign over the past year in particular. We have support from a number of member states, specifically those who are part of the group of Friends of Safety of Journalists, and some of those are Media Freedom Coalition states as well. But our concrete challenge here at this conference is that we'd like all MFC states to support this and the MFC itself. So we'll be putting that forward as a direct challenge tomorrow at the pledging session.
And I will bring my own testimony about the support, is that at the beginning when Antonio Guterres was appointed, we met with him a few weeks after, so it's now a few years ago, and he said, I will do this. I will appoint such a special representative. We know that he didn't do it for the moment. So where are we on this? We had another meeting recently with him.
Yes, so at the start of his first term, he did tell Christophe, I will do it, but it will take time. So we went in again, and now he's just into his second term, and have challenged him to make that a reality now, so that can be his legacy as Secretary General, not another Secretary General that has failed to take action and allowed journalists to continue to be killed on his watch. So he told us he's looking into it. He's tasked a member of his staff with looking into how to take this forward. So we believe it's a really crucial moment for states to show their support. And if it's clear that there's broad consensus, we feel that he will be more likely to take action. So we think it is well beyond time to make this a reality.
And there is, of course, a link between the two initiatives. First, they are complementary to address the same problem, but both of them were recommended by your report of the high-level group created in the framework of the Media Freedom Coalition.
Oh,
Maybe
yes.
you could explain this. Gulnara or Rebecca, I don't know.
Sure. Yeah, it is not the first time that we are talking about the need for creation of this multilateral investigative task force. It first was recommended by Agnes Callamard, then the special rapporteur on extrajudiciary, summary, and arbitrary killings. Then international civil society and community also pushed for that, like International Coalition on Safety of Journalists. And then in the most recent example, it was also a recommendation in the report of the high-level legal panel.
Yep.
Rebecca, do you want to add something on this point?
Well, the high-level panel has also endorsed the need for a UN special representative for the safety of journalists, and a number of other measures were really supportive of the work of the panel. We've endorsed their reports, and one of the challenges, I think, for this conference and going forward is for states to now act on those recommendations, including the two that we've just referenced here.
And if I may add, so the way I see it as well is you have, these states that are unwilling and you have states that are unable to investigate. And I think, therefore, you also need these different types of initiatives to take, different types of actions whenever, a killing of a journalist occurs. So I think it could be very complementary. It's not in competition at all, in my view.
But there are sometimes people saying that in the field of NGO, the competition is really tough. What we can say is that really we work together with the Committee to Protect Journalists for the People's Tribunal.
Yeah, exactly.
And we are really honored to work with you on this, on the other aspects.
Yeah. I think we need to be aware that the situation is so dire, as Rebecca said. There's so many challenges that if we don't coordinate our actions, then nothing will happen. We need to together push for this change to happen. So, totally agree.
Are there some questions in the room? Feel free. We enjoy freedom to ask questions. There's one question. I guess that a microphone will
come to you.
Come to you.
Let me try.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Anastasia Nani. I'm from Republic of Moldova, the Independent Journalism Center. Thank you for your valuable thoughts. You talked about the importance of collaborating between civil society and media institutions, but a key role have media consumers also. And my question is, how do we involve media consumers when it comes to defend journalist rights, especially in these times when the trust in media institutions is going down? Thank you.
This is not an easy question, I have to say. So I'm really glad that some of you will answer to this question.
Yeah, of course. Or do anyone?
Please start, Evelyn.
Yeah, of course. This is, of course, the million-dollar question. How do we create this public demand for justice? And that was one of the reasons why we came up with the idea for a People's Tribunal, because it was very clear that that could generate the attention to the issue on a larger scale. So it's not about one individual journalist, it's about the issue of impunity in general, and that the numbers are so bad that there is no time to waste on acting on this. But in general, or in addition, I must say, we also undertook several other aspects. So, for instance, we developed documentaries as part of the project to reach another audience. We developed podcasts on specific cases to tell the stories of those journalists that were murdered. And I think that's really a way to engage another public. At least that's what we hope, and that's what we've seen up till now. But definitely, we need the public to care about this, because otherwise there's no greater movement behind this at the end to really push the states to take action. So I agree on that very much.
Yes, and I agree with you, Evelyn. And thank you for your question. I'm actually just back from Chisinau. I was there last week, where we had meetings with representatives, high-level representatives of the government of Moldova, and there is a genuine commitment to reform. And Moldova now has draft media development framework and action plan, which is very admirable. When it comes to involving general public, yes, it is important to raise awareness, because at the end of the day, when journalist is attacked, democracy is at risk, so everyone is affected. I would also add that there is a lot of role also for press councils and self-regulatory bodies to engage with audiences, to educate audiences, and media literacy, digital literacy, and basic human rights education, also very important.
Absolutely, to reinforce what you've both said, I think one challenge, especially on my side, I work on the campaigning side, is to make it clear how attacks on journalists, attacks on media affect ordinary people. Because it's never just about the rights of the journalist in question, it's about the impact on freedom of information. And ultimately, when journalists are targeted in this way, the end result is that the public gets less information on stories in the public interest, information that we need to be able to hold governments accountable. So it's about making that case. And it can be really challenging, not just in the more authoritarian part of the world, but even within some MFC states. Too often we're still seeing even these states where there are public officials that are contributing to this hostility against media. it sets a tone. I mean, in the UK, we see things like scum media trending, and then it's no surprise then when, for example, at an anti-vax protest, protesters are then attacking journalists. It's all part of the same trends. And so I think it's that. It's showing ordinary people why they should care, how it impacts them, and making sure that we're holding even our own democratic states to account. And on the trust in media part of the question, we'll get more in depth into that in the second part of this panel.
There's a high competition for questions, so please. Yes, do you have a microphone?
Thanks. Thank you all for really excellent remarks. My question is about accountability. We talk about special rapporteurs, we talk about reporting. As international institutions, as actors, you know, I'm a journalist myself. I'm curious to hear if you also think of readapting the way international institutions respond. Like we talk about advocating for special rapporteurs to report on these issues, right? And we demand them to report on killing of journalists, and we highlight impunity. But are we adapting fast enough to the changes? And are we demanding these changes from the interveners, like the special rapporteurs, fast enough? I don't know if this is clear, but yeah, how we respond faster and better, but also adapt to the changes, because journalists are not, the threats that they're facing are not decreasing.
But I clearly think that the three systemic projects or solutions that are discussed now are not only about reporting. And really, they start from the perception that reporting is not enough. But maybe you want to add something on this.
Yeah, maybe I could give you an example of Belarus also. Thank you for your question, by the way. We could say that there have been so many resolutions on safety of journalists and media freedom, and this has not changed the position and behavior of Erdogan, Putin, and other dictators and press freedom violators a jot. We could say that. At the same time, when we speak about the reaction from intergovernmental bodies and the reports that these intergovernmental bodies produce, we should also remember that actually these reports, they inform an international response. They inform an action by the states, individual states sometimes, that have a specific level of leverage. It could be economic leverage or other type of political leverage over the state in question. And we can say that there has been very orchestrated, synchronized response to the events in Belarus. But it is also largely thanks to the Moscow mechanism that has been activated within the OSCE, Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, where there was a report by an esteemed expert who made his own investigation on the situation of Belarus and consulted civil society groups in Belarus. So this report informed international response in relation to Belarus. This is one example. So we should not think only about reports that are coming from the Council of Europe, UN, etc. We should think about what these reports would trigger.
Is there a last question? We do not have much time. So thank you for not asking a new question. We will be able to go to the next part of the session. I would like really to thank both of you, the three of you. I will not make an exception with Rebecca, Gulnara and Evelyn. It makes me optimist to see that there is such an energy and good cooperation between all of us, and really thank you so much for this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
More to follow. Rebecca will now moderate a second chapter about solutions to address the information chaos and the crisis of trust in media. Up to you, Rebecca, and I will be back later.
Thank you. Maybe to open this part of the session by picking up on that last question from Arzu. In short, no, I think we're not quick enough and adaptive enough in really responding to the new challenges we're seeing to press freedom, to safety of journalists, to free expression more broadly. I think this part of the panel will really get at that. It's a different area of media freedom, but one that is just as important as addressing like the more classical areas such as safety of journalists. At Reporters Without Borders, we really believe that all of these tools are needed, these solutions are needed to address these threats in a holistic way, not just focus on individual areas of media freedom. So we'll now focus a bit more on sort of attacks on freedom of information, the crisis of trust in media, and the information chaos that a few of our speakers will address. We'll start by looking at the Information and Democracy Initiative, and one of our speakers will get into it a bit more, but just to give a bit of context, it is a body that was initiated by RSF in 2018 through the establishment of a commission that included Nobel Peace Prize laureates and other prominent figures around the world, people that you'll know well like Maria Ressa, Can Dündar, Amartya Sen, and Nigat Dad, who will be the first speaker in this part of our panel. The aim of this was to impose democratic safeguards in the digital space, and it's had so many achievements so far in just the first few years. The Information and Democracy Partnership has now been signed by 45 democratic countries, including our host country here, Estonia, and many other members of the Media Freedom Coalition. It has a civil society-led implementation body, which is the Forum on Information and Democracy. And in addition to serving as Reporters Without Borders Secretary General, Christophe Deloy is also the chair of the forum. And so he wears two hats and will be speaking in both capacities on this part of the panel. It's developed a series of expert recommendations, and in fact, a staggering 350 recommendations so far through the publication of 2 landmark reports, How to End Infodemics and A New Deal for Journalism. And it seeks to be a process like climate change in holding annual summits on information and democracy. So we'll turn now to the first speaker in this part who will be joining us virtually, and I hope that she'll be brought up on the screen in a moment. So, hello, Nigat. I can see you on the small screen in front of me. I feel like I have my back to you, but I hope everybody watching at home and here in the audience can see us both well. So, Nigat is a Pakistani lawyer and internet activist. She's also vice chair of the Forum on Information and Democracy. So she'll be speaking to us today on the forum's efforts to counter information chaos. So Nigat, perhaps you could start by talking to us a bit about your involvement with the forum and what it has set out to achieve so far, what has been accomplished.
Sure. Thank you so much, Rebecca, Christophe, dear excellencies, colleagues, friends. I just saw Arzu asking questions. So good to see all of you here. To start with what basically Forum has done so far, I think it's important to talk about, like over the past few years, the fight against mis and disinformation has been on the top of international agenda. Yet what we have seen that the growing awareness of the negative externalities of these services has not really led to a structural change of the information and communication space. And this is partly due to a lack of clear global vision, I believe. And also in order to establish democratic safeguards in the information and communication space, we really need to evaluate periodically that what has been done, what different stakeholders are doing. In September 2021, on the occasion of the first annual summit for information and democracy, held on the margins of the UN General Assembly, the forum announced the forthcoming creation of such an evaluation mechanism. The International Observatory on Information and Democracy, this is called, this observatory is called this. It will have the objective to provide government, civil society, and the research community with a global meta-analysis of the information and communication space. And in order to find appropriate responses to the information chaos, I believe that we must have a common and shared understanding of the situation and the challenges, and that's what that observatory will be doing. The evaluation of the digital space organized by an independent structure with the contribution of civil society, especially the ones who have been doing a lot of work in this space, and the world of research will be a factor of legitimation for the necessary measures. With annual summits and regular evaluation, I believe the forum ambitions to create an international coordination architecture for the information space, similar to the one existing to address climate change, with the annual conference of parties and the reports from the IPCC. Like the IPCC, the Observatory will publish a comprehensive overview of the situation by aggregating all scientific results. And I'll talk more about the Observatory hopefully in the conversation later. And also I hope that the people will ask questions about this, how this Observatory will basically work.
Actually, I'll ask that question to you now, Nagat, just in case nobody gets to it in the audience. So tell us a bit more about the observatory. How will it work?
Sure. So the observatory will be responsible for producing a periodic report evaluating the means, standards, and architectures of the information and communication space. The report will be based on a meta-analysis, as I already said, of the information space, that is to say on an aggregation and synthesis of all available research and data, and can be cross-referenced with data on democratic evolutions. It will cover different aspects. First, observations of phenomena such as disinformation campaigns, information manipulation, online hate, information censorship, digital interference operations, and their effects on democracies across the world, notably on electoral processes, polarization of public debate, public deliberation, weakening of civil concord, etc. The root causes of this phenomena will be part of this report, meaning the structure of the information and communication space, especially the place and role of digital platforms in this space, the impact of design, AI, processes and business model of transnational structuring entities, the risks for democracies, such as their internal weakening to the incapability of national law, and the confusion of content, and the one posed by different regimes which influence the infrastructure and benefit from unfair competition. And finally, it will draw on consequences, highlighting the crucial points on which policymakers must act and defining the objectives to be achieved and the criteria for assessment. So the report will be addressed to governments, political leaders, regulatory bodies, tech companies, digital platforms, and it should feed the global reflection on the regulation of technology, basically.
Thank you, Nagat. And if there were one point that you were to take to states in a very concrete way, the members of the Media Freedom Coalition that will be present today and tomorrow, what would you call on states to do now in support of this?
So I definitely believe, I mean, what Arzu basically said about UN mechanisms and how we make sure that, you know, the instruments and the tools that are out there already, even if states are signatory to those instruments, or you know, they are part of so many governments have signed on to and became part of the forum as well. But I think it's really important that it should reflect in their actions. Becoming part of one initiative is not suffice. It's very important that we can actually see what governments are doing, and if they are agreeing to do something while signing on to some instruments. What we are seeing is that the global north or the Western democracies are setting the agenda and leaving the global south behind. I think we really need to see how in this global discussion we take everyone along with us, even though the democracies that are, you know, like the so-called democracies, basically. So important for governments, while this is like this Media Freedom Coalition is happening at the moment, it's important to see where the global south exists and where they are at the moment, and how we take everyone along with us in these conversations.
Does anybody have questions specifically on that at this point before I invite other panelists to join us here on the stage? And we will have time for Q&A on this entire portion of the panel in a bit. Okay, if not, I will invite Christoph back to the stage, who, as you know, is the Secretary General of Reporters Without Borders and Chair of the Forum on Information and Democracy. So Christoph's going to speak to us now on a slightly different area of RSF's work, our efforts through the Journalism Trust Initiative to counter unfair competition faced by the media, promoting trust and reliable information. So Christoph, tell us a bit about JTI.
I hope that your questions will not be too difficult for me.
It may be even more difficult than for the others.
No, just a few points about our analysis about what type of systemic solutions we have to envisage. In fact, we do believe that there are three levels. There is a level of individuals, of journalists. How do we defend them when their rights are violated? There is a second level, which is the media market. How is it organized? Who in the competition field of information has which floor? And what do we want the news and information media to be? This is the Journalism Trust Initiative. I will get back to this. And this is a micro level about the behavior of actors in a market. And there is a third level, which is the macro level, about the norms, the architecture of the public space. Because in the history of democracies, democratic safeguards were imposed for the public debate in this public space, and they were swept away with the globalization and digitalization of information. And we have to build a new system. This is the aim of the Partnership on Information Democracy, which was discussed. So I get back to the market. In the past, we had a clear media sector, clearly defined, with some obligations, some of them through media regulation, some of them through self-regulation, ethics, journalistic methods, etc. This sector, in fact, does not really exist anymore. There is a direct competition on social networks, on digital platforms between different types of contents, with a sort of competitive advantage for falsehoods, rumors, propaganda, etc., as proven by some studies. So the idea of the Journalism Trust Initiative is to give again a competitive advantage to the content producers, broadcasters, who produce information while respecting journalistic ideals, methods, transparency, editorial independence. And so this is a market solution which started by a standardization process with stakeholders all over the world under the aegis of the European Standardization Committee. This is now a norm, a standard, which has been adopted and published in December 2019. Based on this, we've been working for almost 2 years on a conformity assessment system through the certification market and the digital platforms with the possibility for self-assessment. And built on this, what we can request from digital platforms, from advertisers, from some regulatory bodies, from philanthropists, from different types of stakeholders, is that they provide incentives, advantages to those who comply with the standards. So this is a sort of balance in the market for those who really impose to themselves and are able to prove it that they comply with journalistic standards, that they have some incentives to reverse the logic and give them a competitive advantage.
Well, what's the current state of play in this? What has been accomplished so far and what's happening?
So we have the standard, which is 80 pages document, available for everybody. Different types of stakeholders can use it, even private companies when they want to have some assessments of other media outlets. The certification market was tested by us and by also a certification company which is has a big reputation, which is Deloitte, in different countries on media outlets. They pre-certified some media outlets. And this is difficult to explain how the certification market works, but in all countries, you have certification companies for external audit, and they are themselves certified by accreditors. The first accreditor to say, yes, we will open the market is a US one, ANAB. And they published last July a press release saying, we are now ready to certify some media outlets. It will be ready in the coming weeks for Europe, for European markets. So now it's ready for use. And governments can do a lot, in fact. This is a self-regulatory initiative. But what can governments do?
That was my next question to you, in fact.
No, governments, they can first use co-regulation. And I mean that parliamentary regulation can support self-regulatory mechanisms. And even at the European level, of course, with the European initiatives regarding the information ecosystem. Second, governments can also use, like other stakeholders, the Journalism Trust Initiative standard as a criteria for their own decisions. All stakeholders, they are in front of the problem. There are so many people saying, oh, we are journalists. We want to enjoy the benefits of journalists, sometimes without imposing themselves some duties. So we need some distinctions. And for instance, for public funding in countries where there is an internal public funding, or even for the development aid. And for the media, and we will discuss it later, but for the media in the global south to make decisions, we need to assess what happens. And I have to say that the Journalism Trust Initiative is never about the content. This is absolutely not politically oriented. It cannot be used as such. This is just about, do you respect or not basic principles of journalism when you produce contents?
And these are points that you'll be putting forward tomorrow in the pledging session as concrete challenges to MFC member states. Are there any questions from the floor at this point about the Journalism Trust Initiative or the Information and Democracy Initiative, which Christoph also elaborated on a bit? Maybe to mention as well that we'll be joined by our colleague Olaf Steenfat, who runs the Journalism Trust Initiative project for RSF. Tomorrow he'll be running an information session on this, and he's available as well for chats on the sidelines of this conference. So please come see any of us if you'd like a more in-depth chat beyond this panel on the Journalism Trust Initiative in particular. Well, we have one more guest to join us here on the stage, so I'd like to invite James Dean to join us. James is a long-term partner of RSF. He's the acting director for the International Fund for Public Interest Media. And he'll explain a bit about what that is, because it may not be as familiar to everybody in the room. And he's also the head of policy at BBC Media Action. So James will be speaking on efforts to counter the journalism market failure through the IFPIM. James, why don't we start by explaining what the IFPIM is a bit and what you're working on so far?
So first of all, just let me send apologies on behalf of Sheetal Vyas. She's the executive director of the International Fund, but she's on sick leave at the moment, so I'm standing in her place. So the International Fund for Public Interest Media is designed to mobilize a lot more resources to support independent media, especially in low and middle income countries. But it's also designed to develop and support really long-term systemic solutions to the challenges of a broken business model that we're confronting. And there is no solution to the issue of misinformation and disinformation and our information ecosystems unless there is a way of actually generating trustworthy information. And the model capable of supporting the generation of trustworthy information simply doesn't exist very often in many countries. UN Secretary General Guterres acknowledged that there is a potential media extinction event happening right now, partly because of the broken business model, partly because of the pandemic and the implications of the impact of a pandemic on, often catastrophically, on media revenues around the world, and partly because authoritarian actors, those bent on destroying or undermining democracy, are often highly organized, very well resourced, very strategic about what they do, and they use money to co-opt and capture media systems and undermine independent media. That happens internationally through international investments by authoritarians, and it happens domestically, for example, through the deployment of government advertising. So the challenge the International Fund for Public Interest Media is designed to address is this issue of there has to be more money available for independent media and available to come up with these long-term solutions.
Well, what are the systemic problems facing, in particular, mobilization of money? What would you say to donors?
Well, so I think there's a bunch of problems. First of all, I've got 30, 35 years of experience in the media development sector, and this sector has done and continues to do outstanding work in trying to find ways of making media sustainable, independent, professional, and so on. But the underlying assumption of that whole exercise has been that if organizations become agile enough, entrepreneurial enough, digital enough, they'll ultimately be working towards some kind of sustainable model capable of generating and underpinning editorial content available to underpin democracy, democratic debate. And that simply doesn't exist anymore as an end goal. So one systemic problem we have, which is different from that's existed in the last decades, is that the challenge now is how do you get money into the bank accounts of independent media? And that's a really difficult challenge because ultimately you're choosing who winners and losers. And you have to have a system, a governance structure, a decision-making structure that is tailored and has the legitimacy to take those kind of decisions of actually which institutions should receive funding and which institutions should not. And that's specifically what the International Fund has tried to come up with, is a governance structure heavily drawn from, made up of a board co-chaired by Maria Ressa and by Mark Thompson, former CEO of New York Times, former DG of a BBC, and the rest of the board is being appointed at the moment. But basically made up of really respected journalistic and media figures, an independent board, but also made up of people who really understand finance and how to run a fund, advised by an advisory council. So that's one systemic challenge, is actually how do you get money into bank accounts? The second systemic challenge is actually what is the current way in which media is supported. You can't really fix the market or create this kind of enabling economic environment for media that's necessary through 1, 2, 3 year projects. We can't work any longer just at the institutional level. We have to do that. We have to work at the system level. We have to find ways of bringing together the private sector, the media, development banks, governments if they're supporting democracy, all stakeholders in a really long-term project or long-term exercise of actually finding a way of creating and solving this business model challenge. You can't, the international fund's not meant to be a kind of constant kind of bandage, if you like, on a crisis. We have to find a way out of that. But it's very difficult to see what the way out of it is without really kind of long-term comprehensive approach. And I probably haven't got time for this, but the final one is about the aid system as well, but maybe we'll come back to that.
Sure, maybe we can pick it up a bit in the discussion. I think one question for you, and then we'll open it up for questions for both of you and for Nigat as well, who I hope is still on the line. For their part, what can states do? What concrete challenge would you put forward to the MFC member states at this conference in how they can help ensure media viability?
So the challenge I put forward is this, is that statements, calls for media freedom, coalitions are not enough. There is a need for resources. We cannot solve this problem without more resources. Development assistance stands at about 0.3% to independent media and the free flow of information. I've been advising the OECD Development Assistance Committee for about a decade, trying to improve the prioritization and coordination of development assistance in this area. Despite a lot of work done by many, that figure's been pretty well static. It has barely gone up at all. The system is quite competitive, it's quite fragmented, it's quite short-term. And actually, the development system itself doesn't really have doesn't allocate the resources, but it doesn't allocate the attention, the number of people required, really, to take the kind of quite challenging political risk-associated approaches that the current challenge now requires. So I think the challenge I'd have is, please make your own assessment of how important independent media is to democracy and to development. And if that assessment leads you to conclude that it's pretty indispensable to the protection of development and pretty indispensable to the advancement of democracy in an age of misinformation, disinformation, forthcoming challenges of climate change and so on, well then that will require resources. And it will require not massive more resources, actually. If we can just double from 0.3 to 0.6%, that would make quite a big dent in what's needed to happen. If we can get it up to 1%, which is what Maria Ressa called for in her Nobel Peace Prize lecture, then we're really on the way to doing something about this. But there's been very little sign, except for a few real leading countries, that challenge is being responded to, sufficiently anyway.
Christoph, maybe I'll bring you back in just for a moment. As in the first part of our panel, at RSF, we certainly see these various initiatives as mutually reinforcing and complementary. These are all needed. Christoph, maybe you could comment on how they fit together and our vision sort of in partnership.
But I described our analysis about the three levels. And if you have a look at the initiatives, I think that they fit with the three levels, and they answer to their responses to the issues or to the problems at the three levels. And we do work with the fund, from the project of the fund from the beginning. We do partner with the other organizations, and I would say that we even partner with governments, democratic governments. And this is also another aspect, which is that in the past, we could consider, there are the governments and there is civil society. And civil society criticizes governments or says, you should do more. But problems are so important. The change of paradigm is so deep that I think that we as NGOs, we have to act directly, not ask others to act. And that's why we at RSF, for instance, regarding the law, in the past, we used the law to defend journalists. Then we decided that we would fight back and use strategic litigation to exercise pressure on, let's say, press freedom predators. And then we decided, we have to go forward and even contribute to the definition of the norms, and to help build new norms, to help build a new ecosystem, new rules for the markets. And that's what we do with these initiatives, and that's why this dialectics between civil society organizations and NGOs, civil society organizations and governments is so important today, while respecting the roles and the independence of everybody. But I think that, for instance, we do believe that the Media Freedom Coalition has an important role to play, even regarding the Journalism Trust Initiative, for instance. And we were really lucky to see that the organizers of the Summit for Democracy in the US, they were interested by those systemic initiatives. And that we are now at a key moment when we had really to work together to build a public space, a public sphere, which is now globalized and digitalized in the future with a system of safeguards. And that's what we are doing, and that's what I think that the sign that we co-organize is even today with the Estonian Ministry for Foreign Affairs, sorry, is also a strong sign, and that there are new ways to work together.
That's a constant theme throughout our work is, as you mentioned at the beginning, that we're changing sort of how we work, and we have to be in partnership. We, of course, criticize states still. We still do the naming and shaming. We still do protests and more provocative campaigns, but we certainly are willing to talk directly, even to the worst offenders, I have to say, and to partner with democratic states on areas where we have mutually aligned goals. Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, first of all, just to pay huge tribute to Christoph and the forum. So it's been absolutely indispensable in providing the kind of first of all, the intellectual leadership, I think, in terms of actually tackling these huge intellectual challenges of how to reconcile tensions between media freedom and civic discourse and polarization and hate speech and so on. The second thing is on kind of the policy leadership. Things like the New Deal for journalism, led by Rasmus Nielsen at Reuters Institute and Samir Padania. Fantastic exercise in providing an overarching framework, an agenda for action for governments, for policymakers, for other donors, for other actors, other policy actors. A recipe, this is what needs to happen. We don't need so much more talking, we need action. And that's what the New Deal, I think, was the challenge from that, was absolutely brilliant. And then very practical things like the Journalism Trust Initiative, which we at the International Fund intend to incorporate into our own systems of actually working out how to allocate funding in the future. And we will be signing a memorandum of understanding this evening at 6 o'clock Tallinn time, where between the Forum, RSF, and the International Fund, where we really articulate in a lot more detail how these things are really linked together.
And we're so pleased to be able to announce that here. I believe that will be available on the live stream as well, so those at home can join to see that. And Niga, I can see that we still have you. Do you have, before I go to the floor for questions, do you have anything to add about this sort of idea of working together with states and how we move forward as civil society and states to address these challenges?
Sure. I mean, as I already said, that while we are having these global conversations, we really need to take along, the governments where we see a lot of repression against media freedom and where journalists are facing new challenges, specifically in digital spaces. Yes, definitely, we need to name and shame them, but also need to see where we can engage governments, specifically for the journalists who are still, doing journalism while living in these countries. That's one thing, but also I think important, although I'm part of the independent oversight board of Meta, and the reason that I became member of the board was that how we can, because these platforms have become so much part of our lives, how we can hold them accountable while being part of, self-regulatory mechanisms. So yes, important not just to hold governments and states accountable, but also how these digital platforms are actually impacting journalism and democracies around the world.
Well, at this point, are there questions from anybody in the room for any of these three panelists? Or we still have our earlier panelists with us as well. So if anybody has any additional questions or comments from earlier too, please speak up. Arzu, we've got a mic coming to you.
Thanks. I have a question on the long-term financial support for media platforms. And perhaps this is something out of the traditional forms of support, but what about crypto? What about, the alternative forms of supporting? And is it even in the discussion, in the conversation, or are we still thinking more traditional? And how do we make sure that this is long-term? Because a lot of the funding that comes in, it's for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, and then the platforms have to reapply again. So the long-term sustainability versus alternative models, that would be, my question. Thanks.
James, do you maybe want to take a crack?
So first thing I should say is I'm going to be giving a bit more of an update on the progress of the International Fund at that session at 1800 in terms of what we're doing and where it's got to and where it's going. But absolutely, the fund will be has to balance various things. So the first thing, absolutely, the recognition is that what organizations most need is institutional, predictable, long-term support. And that they need to do that in ways that they can allocate those resources. We have to be careful, but money doesn't simply go off to shareholders if it's a commercial operation, but it doesn't create dependency, but it doesn't deter innovation, but it doesn't simply create to protect incumbents at the detriment of new entrants, all those kind of issues. That's what the fund will have to be balancing and is trying to, it will be designed to be working its way through. But in terms of its DNA, long-term, predictable, structured support to enable organizations to weather this crisis, and then associated with that, a set of strategies to try and work at the systemic level to make sure the fund doesn't need to exist forever. We hope it will be out of existence in a decade. In terms of other models, we are open to any suggestions of how to mobilize money, any suggestions of how to solve this problem. And this is, there will be a kind of, amongst other things, a kind of what works unit within the fund, which is fundamentally trying to work out what are the most interesting ways of actually solving the problems it's designed to address, capturing those, working with other media support organizations, others who are also trying to address these issues, trying to complement that, feed into those as well. So, you know, those are all absolutely, that's what I hope the DNA of a fund is.
Christoph, did you have a point to add?
We are not here, that's the same for all of us, to defend the past and to try to get back to the past world, considering that it was perfect. But to find ways to secure in the future, not an industry, not a sector, not private interests, but a social function, the social function which is supposed to be the one of journalism, which is to be trusted third parties for our individual and collective choices. And I will end with a confession. I don't know on the long term what journalism will be. Or I'm sure that it will be a set of principles and that we will need, whatever happens in the future, trusted third parties, people or sometimes other types of production capacities to bring us information which we can trust. And this is what we have to defend, and what all of us we do is that we prepare this for the future. And that's really a key question, because all of us, we know that even journalists are clearly not perfect. Some of them are close to perfect, and some of them are not. And what we defend is an ideal, and really something which is useful, and that's really important in a moment where there is such a crisis of distrust by the public, but also some doubts about, do we really need journalism? And this is not the key question. The key question is right to information, which is a right for everybody, and how can we support this right? And what can be our contribution to this right? This is also about scientific information. This is not just pure journalistic information, but this is how do we secure this, and how do we avoid that we do live in the future in a world where the pluralism will be between different types of propaganda, rumors, etc. And this is what we have to escape from.
Nigat, do you have a comment to add on that?
Not really. I mean, again, I would say that I think I always bring, the global south and the developing countries in the debate. I feel like that has become my job in the international conferences. But the situation is really worse when it comes to propaganda war or disinformation campaigns, specifically against journalists and media organizations. And I feel that, yes, the burden lies on the democratic states and the tone that they are setting at the moment. But at the same time, it's really important to see the initiatives like Forum, for instance. We really need all these models in place doing really innovative things, bringing research on ground, bringing different ideas in the conferences, but also the fund, for instance, like Arzu asked a question, and that was a very important question. There are organizations and journalists who can still receive fund, but then there are countries where you cannot even get these funds, even though the fund is available. So I think there are all these situations that one needs to keep in mind and see that the solutions that we are proposing should be in global nature, keeping the local context in mind.
That's always really important to bear in mind. Are there any more questions from here in the room? A follow-up from Arzu? We love active questions here.
I mean, if there's anybody else, I'm happy to give the mic to. But my question is actually to Nigad, and it's about the responsibility of social media platforms. I work a lot with them, specifically when journalists are threatened or harassed on their platforms. And I think one of the questions I think of often is, we criticize them as journalists, as media platforms, for not doing enough. Now, as someone who's on the oversight board, Nigad, what is it that we can do better in communicating our grievances with these platforms like Meta to get them actually do enough, like to get them to the point, whether it's responding to an emergency situation, whether it is addressing the needs of these platforms, whether it is removing content that is harassing them or that is spreading misinformation. Thanks.
And I'll just point out before Nighat responds to that I find this really powerful, the exchange between the two of you, because I know you're both subjected to really intense online abuse and harassment, and very conscious of the experiences that are leading you to these views. So just to note that, and we'll be addressing protection of journalists in other panels too, and these sort of risks to safety, particularly of women journalists. But I thought I'd take moderator's privilege to interject that. Nighat, do you want to take Arzu's question?
Sure. I think this sort of question applies to all social media platforms and not just Meta. The kind of resources and the money these platforms have, I definitely believe they are not doing enough. With Meta, at least now they have self-regulatory mechanism like oversight board, and people like us are sitting there who have like on-ground experiences when it comes to digital violence, cyber harassment, doxing. Arzu, just for your information, yesterday we released, the board released this policy advisory opinion on releasing private residential information, and gave recommendations to Meta, specifically around doxing and the harassment that people sort of face when their private residential information is released under the disguise of public information. So there are these things that the board is doing, but I definitely believe that they really need to do more, given the resources that they have. But also now that the oversight board is there, we try to engage with multi-stakeholders, specifically media organizations and journalists, and would love to engage more with the ones who are in different contexts and have like very diverse experiences. So there is this one way to hold the company accountable. At least I can say on the behalf of the oversight board that we are there to listen to people and see what are the things that we can do, specifically around the cases that come to us as appeals, and then the policy advisory opinions that we are releasing, and the first one we released yesterday.
This is the last chance for a question from the floor. Anybody else? I'll turn to Christoph in a moment just for a short conclusion, but just to note that we will be covering some of these areas in other panels. James mentioned today at 6 p.m. we'll have the actual signing of the partnership, which everybody is welcome to join. And tomorrow, Christoph will get into some of these threats in terms of misinformation, disinformation on the plenary panel, and I'll be discussing some of the safety of journalists issues on the protection panel as well. And we are around over the next couple of days, as are our other speakers, so please don't hesitate to approach any of us for separate conversations on this, and we hope that this conference will really be the start of really a more robust dialogue and more concrete action taken by all member states of the MFC. And Christoph, oh, James went, sure.
Can I just say one thing, because I didn't mention this in terms of the platforms. Clearly for the International Fund, we hope significant, substantial resources will be coming from an increase in development assistance, but also from the platforms from other private sector companies with an interest in protecting democracy and actually looking to their own long-term future of actually how the markets in which they are going to be working in. And of course other philanthropies, particularly those who are not currently supporting independent media. And the final thing I should say is that we are being very clear about the International Fund that we're talking about additional resources. We are not talking about reallocating resources from existing media support, and we are not accepting any funding that is simply rearranging budgets which are already existing for media. It has to be additional. We need scaling up of effort, and we need this to be seen not just as a financial response, but it could really be seen as a kind of really symbol and signal of multilateral democratic cooperation in the face of absolutely catastrophic losses for revenue of media around the world, associated losses in terms of media freedom around the world. And really, unfortunately, the authoritarians are winning at the moment. We need to be much more organized in defense of democracy than we currently are.
Absolutely. Christoph, some final thoughts?
No, just a few sentences. We are clearly in a moment of crystallization of those systemic solutions. And we didn't say everything. I could have mentioned the fact that we created a JTI campus towards the global south to use JTI as a way to improve the level, the quality of journalism in the global south. And we do work now with many especially media development organizations, all together, and some of them are part of this conference in Estonia, to use this reference of JTI for media literacy, for courses, for self-assessment of media, so that they upgrade their way of working. And that's really important. I said that we are in a moment of crystallization, but we need governments to stimulate this crystallization. And beyond conferences, what we need is technical work. And we want even to work with governments at the technical level to really implement the solutions. And hopefully this conference will help this, and hopefully this panel, co-organized with the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Estonia, will help this.
Yes, thank you so much to the Estonian MFA for making this possible. Thank you to all of our panelists from both parts of our discussion, to those who attended in person and to those who are following remotely. Wishing everybody a very productive conference and an even more productive year ahead.